In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Brett, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. And so you are one of two co-hosts on the podcast, The Prosecutors. So as the name suggests, you are a prosecutor. How long have you been a prosecutor?
So I've been a prosecutor now since 2018. So I guess going on 7 years. Yeah,
Okay.
which is hard to believe because normally I can't keep a job for more than like 2. So I'm considering this a major success.
Just because of boredom, or is that an issue on your part?
I was telling somebody I'm surprised I got this job because if you look at my resume, you would think, man, he can't keep a job. But yeah, I really like, or I used to like, before I became mature and grounded.
Yes.
I liked moving around a lot. I'd do about 2 years in a job and be like, okay, I've learned all I can learn in this job. I'm ready to do something else. But now I'm committed. I'm an adult. So.
Yes, of course. Yeah, we're here. We're adulting. That's kind of how it is in the Air Force. They make you switch jobs like every 2 years, basically. And I hate that. And I fight it. And I'm like, I do not want to learn a new job. Can you just let me get good at what I do? But,
they figured it out. It's a perfect amount of time.
Oh, see, but I can't stand it. I cannot stand that. Take me back to when you were a kid. What were you like as a kid?
Okay.
For the day you were born. Let's start from the beginning. No.
Yeah. I was probably, a nerdy little kid. I was always into, history and books and stuff. I'm a terrible athlete. I can't hit a ball or throw a ball or anything.
Me either.
I tried desperately and I just can't do it. So I was always much more on the nerdy side and always kind of knew I wanted to do something like be a lawyer. I guess when you're a kid, you don't want to be a lawyer or a doctor sort of thing. It's
yeah,
like one of the two. It's like those go together.
Yeah.
And I'm terrible at math and science. So it was lawyer or bust. So that's what I ended up doing. But I haven't changed all that much, I think, since I was a kid. I'm maybe a little bit better socially adapted, but
maybe
still a nerd at heart.
Maybe a little better at math. Or is that still not it?
Well, probably not.
So when was it? So, as a kid, I feel like we always have these things where it's like, I'm going to be a vet or a doctor. And it's just like these categories. When were you like looking into the profession a little more seriously?
It's hard for me to even remember exactly when I decided I was going to be a lawyer because I've thought I was going to be a lawyer for as long as I can remember, which is funny because I don't have any lawyers in my family. I don't come from a legal family. But that was just always what I wanted to do. And then when I went to college, I was a philosophy and a history major. So basically it was either go to law school or starve. And I decided to go to law school, which was what I was always going to do. But if I decided not to, that would have been a problem because I did not have any employable skills. And here I am.
That's so funny. I majored in Spanish because I couldn't decide what I wanted to major in, and then people are like, oh, you're gonna be like a Spanish teacher, and I'm like, no, I still can like hardly speak the language. I was like, no. So literally my only option was the military, so that's why I went that route. That's so
Gotcha.
funny. Oh my gosh. And
Gotcha.
So you went to Harvard and Alice went to Yale, is that correct?
That's right.
Oh my gosh.
That's correct.
Okay, what is Harvard like? Because I literally my only reference of Harvard is, this is embarrassing, but it's Legally Blonde. That's literally my only reference.
So Legally Blonde is incredibly accurate when it comes to Harvard, which is, I always tell people that and they're always surprised by that. I will say this, Harvard is kind of like Hogwarts, particularly if you're somebody like me who I just never even dreamt that was a possibility. But you go there and everything's so old and it's so grand. And, it's like, this is where this famous person sat when they were here. And this is, President Kennedy, this was where his dorm room was or whatever. It's just the whole thing is like that. But Legally Blonde is really accurate. Like there's that scene in Legally Blonde where right after she gets in, they're all sitting in a circle and talking about their sort of past lives. And the one guy's like, it's widely believed that Stephen Hawking plagiarized my third grade paper or whatever. And it's exactly that absolutely happens. So I remember doing that with the board of student advisors. And I think one of the guys in the movie has one of their shirts on, and you're literally sitting in the grass and going around circles. And I remember, one girl was like, it was, tell us about yourself. And one girl said, I've been evacuated by the Marines 3 different times in 3 different African countries during my work with the Peace Corps or whatever. It's like, wow. And then one guy, had been a stockbroker for 5 years with Goldman Sachs before he came. And it was just all these people. And then it gets to me, and I'm just like, hey, guys, I'm from Alabama. I like college football. If y'all want to watch a game together, I'm always up for it. Because I didn't have anything like that. And it was very Legally Blonde, these people, because it was some, I don't know why I was there, because it was some brilliant people, some of the smartest people I've ever met. Like I remember one of the guys in my class in the old days, I don't know if you remember this, but the Wall Street Journal didn't use pictures. It used like those dot pictures. So like everybody's picture was like a dot picture. And one of the guys in my class had a dot picture because he'd been in the Wall Street Journal several times. It was stuff like that. Ben Shapiro was in my class.
Oh, really?
He's now famous. Yeah. So it was just wild like that.
Oh my gosh. And okay, so law school in general, when is it that you have to start kind of deciding what type of law you're going to practice?
So never if you go somewhere like Harvard, because they don't teach you anything anyway. If you go to real law school, then it's good to know what you want to do and what you want to focus on. Most people at Harvard, number one, Harvard directs you so heavily to big law because they really want you to go work at a big law firm, make a lot of money, and give a lot of it back to Harvard. Like, that's the dream of the law school. I had a friend once who's now a federal judge, and he told me, he was older, like a mentor type person, and he told me, you get here and you think you can do anything, and by the time you leave, you think there's only one thing you can do, and that's go to a law firm. And so don't ever let that happen to you. And it's true. And I had one friend who I'm always so impressed with, who she got there and all she wanted to be was a prosecutor. That's what she wanted to do. She wanted to be a prosecutor, and she got to Harvard and she focused. She did criminal law. She did every hands-on thing she could do. She was interning at the DA's office. She was doing all that stuff. I call them clinicals because I think it makes it sound more like we're doctors, but it's actually just going out and doing hands-on stuff. And all she wanted to do was go back to San Francisco and get a job at the San Francisco DA's office, which is a pretty tough gig to get because that's a big city, really prestigious DA's office. But she worked there both summers, and when she graduated, that's what she did. And I was always so impressed with her that she just completely ignored the way they try and funnel you. I did not succeed at that. I did not want to work at a law firm. I wanted to do something like I'm doing now, but got totally sucked into the law firm thing, went to a law firm and hated every single minute of it. I spent 1 year at a law firm, and that was enough for me. It's been public service ever since.
What was it about the law firm that was not your thing?
It's funny. I was having this conversation with somebody today. It is, if you haven't done it, it's almost impossible to explain. A couple things. Billing time, like every minute matters. I remember going to your orientation and they teach you how to bill. And it's like the only rule was you cannot bill more than 24 hours a day. And you might wonder, how is it possible to bill more than 24 hours a day? It's actually pretty easy because the way it works is if someone calls you and you pick up the phone and they ask a question and you say yes and put the phone down, that is 15 minutes of work because we build in quarter hours, right? So that 1 minute phone call is 15 minutes of work. So if you had 15 calls in 15 minutes, that's actually like however many hours, math again, I don't know. That's however many hours that would be. So you had to be careful when you're billing not to actually get over 24 hours because you worked all the time. So you were constantly doing things and just keeping track of every moment. You never have a free moment because you're expected to bill so many hours a year. So a holiday is not a holiday. It's a day you don't bill. So it's a bad thing because that's just another, you're going to have to make that day up somewhere. So if you take a day off for Christmas, that's 24 hours that you didn't bill. And at the end of the year, they're not looking at how many days you worked. They're looking at how many hours you billed. And it's like they just grind you down. It's a terrible environment. Everybody hates each other. It's awful. It's awful. I mean, and it's, some people love it. It's their thing. Just like some people love being like stockbrokers or whatever, like those jobs that are really high stress, or
Right.
mergers and acquisitions or something. Like there are some people who are made for it. It was not me. I was not made for it.
That's
And I can accept that.
Yeah, that's funny that you bring up that billing the hours thing. 'Cause in my master's, I was taking this ethics class, and they would have, all these hypothetical scenarios. And there was one about how a lawyer was billing, and it was like, was this ethical? Blah, blah, blah. But like describing it, it was literally what you were saying. And I'm reading these questions, and I was like, what is this? Like, what is this? And I'm trying to Google it because I didn't know how to answer the question because none of it made sense. That makes sense. I could never deal with that at all. But so then you move over to public service. So what is that like now?
Oh, it's so much better. And that's the other thing about working at a
Mhm.
law firm. Like I remember we had this big client, Fortune 50 company, and I did foreign corrupt practices. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act basically says don't bribe foreign governments for your business. And this is actually harder than you might think. That might seem simple, but the fact of the matter is, in most countries that aren't the United States and aren't Europe, that's how you do business. So, like, if you're in Brazil or Nigeria, which are big ones, or anywhere in the Middle East, the expectation is you will pay bribes. And if you don't, you're rude. It's like, you do not respect me in my position. You're not going to offer me a bribe. And other countries, Russia and China, are all about it. They're
Yeah.
like bribe away. And that's one way they gain a competitive advantage, because basically you show up, let's say you show up in Nigeria and they're going to sink a new oil well and they need infrastructure, and you build infrastructure for oil wells, and you're competing against a Chinese company. Chinese are going to bribe them like crazy, right? United States, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which says we shouldn't be encouraging people to take bribes. So don't do that. And obviously companies get tied up in it all the time, because what'll happen, you'll have some local guy who's working there. His whole job is dependent on getting this contract, right? So the company doesn't know he's doing it, but he's paying the bribes. He's doing it through shady deals or whatever. But the problem is he's part of the company. So when he does it, the company's on the hook. So the companies will often find out about it later on. They'll turn themselves in, but it doesn't matter. They can still get in trouble for it. And I say all this because this company in particular had like this reputation for not doing that. They did not bribe people. It was really important to them. And so we're fighting with the federal government over this bribery allegation. And the feds are like, hey, just pay some minimal fine. It's no big deal. Like nothing. Just pay like $1 million fine. No big deal. Well, it'll go away. Like you've done your thing. But the company didn't want the headline. They did not want the headline, company pays fine for bribe in whatever country. And it was so important to them that they're paying us millions of dollars to prevent having to pay the government $1 million because they don't want this headline. And, when you're working really hard and that's the outcome, like maybe we can avoid the headline. It's hard to get inspired to go
Yeah.
work a 12-hour day, right? When that's all it's about. And we won. They never got the headline. Eventually the feds were just like, forget it. Like, we don't care anymore. And they went away. It's like, yay, victory, right? But how does that matter to you? I mean, does that make you feel like you accomplished something? And look, I mean, you did, and that's great, but I would much rather do things that I feel like have a tangible effect on just the average person, right? So whether it's you doing what I'm doing now, or just working in policy areas, I mean, whatever it is, I like that so much better. The pay's not as good, but the hours are better, and you feel like every day you're going in there and you're making a difference, and that's important to me. And so that's one of the reasons I like doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like there's two kinds of people where they're like, I don't care what I do. I can just sit and work all day. As long as I'm making decent money, it's fine. I'm definitely one of the people where I'm like, I feel like I need to be doing something that I at least think, it's making a difference in some small way. I totally get that. Um, so then, okay, so you switched to public service. What is your workload usually like? I worked or interned for a time at my county's public defender's office, and I had no experience working in like any sort of legal setting. I was interning as an investigator, and I was like astonished at the caseload that a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
public defenders have. Like hundreds of cases at a time. Obviously, they're not all, things aren't all happening at the same time with them and whatever, but it was really shocking. And I feel like not that many people realize like how busy it is. How busy is it on the prosecution side? Do you know?
So it's much busier at a public defender's office, just because a lot of times public defenders, federal defenders, whoever it is, they're dealing with sort of multiple jurisdictions. Not so much federal defenders, but public defenders. Like you might have a public defender's office that they got city cases coming in, and they got maybe some county cases they're doing. They got some of these other cases, so they're taking them from all sides. It just depends on how it's set up, and all of them are set up differently. And they tend not to have as many resources as prosecutors' offices do for personnel. So it seems like, in my experience, there are more prosecutors than defenders. That's typically the way it is. And also you expect that some number of people who are in the criminal justice system are going to hire their own lawyers. So, you're always trying to figure out how that works. So I think it is harder on defense attorneys, the prosecutors, and defense attorneys are purely reactive. If you're a defense attorney and you're covered up with cases, you can't say, I mean, you can to some extent, but not really when you're a public defender. You can't say, I can't take any more cases.
Right.
Let's not have any more crime. Let's stop crime.
Hold off
right?
now. Okay.
Whereas prosecutors at least have some leverage to say, I got a lot on my plate right now, so I'm going to wait to indict that case. I'm going to wait a month. I'm going to clear this one off, and then I'll deal with that. Right. Or, prosecutors also can always cite the resources argument. A lot of cases, people would be surprised at how many crimes are committed where the evidence is there that are never prosecuted because the prosecutors say, look, we just don't have time for this. You can commit a lot of low-level crime and never be prosecuted. It's actually become a problem in some places. If you follow the news, you've seen this about sort of low-level retail theft. Now it's become a big issue because they're just not prosecuting those cases. And some of it gets, spun politically as if it's some sort of political thing, and maybe some of it is, but some of it's just resources. If you've got a bunch of violent crimes and murders and robberies and rapes coming through your office, you don't have as much time to deal with a shoplifter. And if people realize that and sort of that are prone to commit crimes, they're going to commit more crimes. I mean, that's just the way it is. And then you got more crimes you have to deal with, and it's like a vicious cycle. But for me, I'm pretty good. I'm at a level now where I do more supervision than I do on the ground stuff at this point. So I kind of take whatever cases I want, and then I do all the appeals for my office, which I really enjoy. So my criminal caseload is pretty low at this point. I jump on some stuff here and there if I think it's interesting, and then I do all the appeals. But for me, I'm just really good at that. Maybe not good substantively, but I'm good at doing it and doing it quickly. So I have a pretty good thing going right now where I'm able to work a pretty regular job, do my job and do it well, which leaves time to do the podcast.
I always ask these stupid like logistical questions. They're probably really boring, but like, how do you guys like organize yourselves? Like, are you like the appeals guy, and then like, does everyone kind of have their like areas of expertise?
So different offices do it different ways, of course. Our office is relatively small, so that's actually a good thing. In big offices, it's very siloed. So I used to work at a big office in Virginia, and the way it worked there is you went in and you start off basically as a violent crime prosecutor. You did violent crimes, sort of got your experience there, and then eventually you got siloed into something. Maybe you got really good at the child pornography cases. You ended up prosecuting that. Or maybe you got really good at doing wires and doing complex drug cases. So you did that. Or maybe you became a white collar attorney and you became a fraud. And so that's what you did. And that's all well and good because it does develop that expertise, but that's all you do all day. And you can imagine, like if all you did all day was child pornography cases, you'd want to jump off a building, right? So the good thing about having a smaller office is you just don't have that much. So I've done in my time, I've done the simplest gun case to the most complex white collar case. I've done wire cases, the drug trafficking cases. I've done simple drug cases. I've done some very sort of weird cases. I've done, online threat cases, which are interesting because they have all these First Amendment aspects, and civil rights violation cases. And that's great. I really like that. And then because I do all the appeals, and that's how our office works, it's not how every office works, I can see all the cases. And I often will get involved in them early on to try and either head off possible problems or just know they're coming. So I'm familiar with them beforehand. So I get a lot of experience across the office and all the different stuff. And I really like that.
What would you say are the like most common cases that you guys deal with?
So the most common case in our office, it's going to be different depending on sort of what your prosecutor's office is. Ours is definitely felon in possession cases, because felon in possession is like, tax evasion for Al Capone. Basically, every criminal you can think of probably has committed a felony before and has a gun. And it's really easy to prove that case, because if you find them with a gun, they have committed a crime. Whereas if he's the head of the local, sect of the gangster disciples or something, or the Crips or the Bloods, pinning a RICO charge on him, getting him for a drug conspiracy is going to be really difficult, because the lower level guys just don't talk. There's a culture of not snitching. So that's really hard. And you can have people who are committing some really terrible crimes, and you just don't know how to get them. But you can get them through, he's always going to be carrying a gun, and like you pull him over, you follow him around until he violates a traffic law. And then what's he doing? He's got a gun on him, and then you can prosecute him. So that is a lot of cases. Those are the easy cases, simple cases. They don't go to trial very often. They're the most common. And then I think the next most common is your drug trafficking cases. So where we sit is along the pipeline of methamphetamine from Mexico to Atlanta. So you see a lot of those cases, people setting up drug deals, setting up trafficking, bringing kilos of meth up. Like the old days of the Walter Whites, even like Walter White, the whole thing about him, I don't know if you ever watched that show, Breaking Bad, but the whole thing about him was he made such pure crystal meth. And at the time, that was a big deal, because, your sort of traditional thought of how do you make methamphetamine? It's some dude in the woods in a trailer with battery acid about to blow himself up, right? And that meth was very low quality. It was like, if you got 40% meth, that was great. So Walter White comes around and he's making 97, 98% pure. Now, those guys in the trailers, Walter White has put them out of business. But it's not Walter White, it's the Mexican cartels. They have these super labs in Mexico that produce pure methamphetamine. And so that is where all the meth comes from now, is it comes from Mexico. And so we are involved in all that.
That's interesting. I started watching Breaking Bad. I haven't finished it yet. I need to. It's like on my list. But I know exactly what you're talking about. How many cases generally go to trial? Because I think people think it's a lot, but I don't think it's as much as people think it is.
Very few.
Yeah.
Very few. I mean, if you think about the way cases work, so the average case comes into the office, and I would say if an officer, a good officer, brings a case to you, it's probably going to get indicted. But not all of them do. The first, line of defense for the Constitution is the prosecutor's office, not the defense attorney's office. And we're supposed to evaluate those cases and determine, number one, are they worth prosecuting? Because the resources I talked about earlier. But number two, do you have the evidence to actually proceed? I think probably 10%, maybe higher. Maybe more like 20% of the cases that come in are not prosecuted. They're what we call declined. And we decline to prosecute them. They go away. So those go away. So there's not even considered. Now, why is that important to your question? Because one of the things you're supposed to be doing is weeding out cases where there are weaknesses or where there's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Generally speaking, when you indict a case, the goal, and this is not always true because sometimes you have to move quickly or you're still investigating or whatever, but the goal is, if I indict a case in front of a grand jury where the standard is probable cause, which basically means it's not even 50%. It's like, is there a good reason to think a crime happened? That's all it takes to indict somebody. But as a prosecutor, you really want to be able to, if you had to, turn around the next day and try the case. So that you have all the evidence, you have beyond a reasonable doubt, you're ready to go. So if you indict a case, that's your expectation. Most cases, the evidence is overwhelming. So, we were talking about felon in possession cases. Most times, where is it possessed? On the person. If you have a gun in your pants, it's hard to argue you didn't possess that weapon, right? Most drug cases, if you have a wire where the person who you arrested is talking about selling methamphetamine, that's pretty good evidence, right? Stuff like that. So usually it's overwhelming. And generally speaking, what will happen in about 90% of cases, it's a really high number. The prosecution prosecutes the case, and at some point shortly after arraignment, where you turn over the evidence, you turn over discovery, give it to the defense. The defense attorney goes through that discovery. At some point, you get an email or a phone call, and they'll say, okay, well, how do we resolve this? Right? Because they've looked at the evidence and they know he got my guy dead to rights. What can we do? Is there something we can give you? Can we work out a deal? Can this guy work? Can he become an informant? Can hear a bunch of reasons to feel sorry for him or to think there's some mitigation? Can we drop some charges? And usually those people will, in those cases, they almost always plead guilty.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say that was my experience with the time I worked at the public defender's office. I would help review all the discovery. And I think the time I was there, it was like hundreds of cases I had helped kind of look through. I only saw one trial, and it was a mess. But it was like I can't remember what the name of the charge was. It was like in possession of a stolen firearm or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those things where we were at least able to show that like he didn't intend to have it based on the circumstances and stuff like that. Yeah.
I was about to say, we almost never charge those because it's so hard to prove they knew it was stolen.
Mm-hmm.
Like, usually you try and charge them with something else, and then you maybe try and hit them with an enhancement for possessing a stolen firearm, right?
Yep.
Because it's so hard to prove those. And so it doesn't surprise me that went to trial. And you usually can tell, if you've got, I'll give you an example of when you can tell. So let's say police pull over a guy. He's got no criminal record. They search the car. It's a perfectly legitimate search, and they find a backpack. And in the backpack is a gun, which is perfectly legal for him to have. But there's also a very small amount of drugs, very small amount. But also, let's say, a scale. Let's say some baggies, right? That's indicative of trafficking. So mm-hmm. He doesn't have much in the way of drugs, but he's got these things that would make you think he's weighing drugs out. Well, that's the case where a defense attorney might roll the dice and say, look, and go into trial and say, look, my client is 100% guilty of possessing drugs. We'd plead guilty to that today, but he's not a drug dealer, right? And a lot of times that's what trials are about. It's not so much I am completely innocent. Mm-hmm. It's some way to shade that or to go at the charges, or there's like one weak element or something, right? So that's typically what a trial is. I think a lot of people, because especially if you follow true crime, you feel like, man, every case is close and there's a good innocence argument for everybody. And in reality, the reason those cases are famous is because they are the exception. The cases where you have a really good actual innocence argument are few and far between. Usually everybody knows you're guilty, and it's better for you just to go ahead and plead guilty, accept responsibility, and tell the judge, like, hey, I've been completely cooperative. I did it, cut me a break.
Yeah. I've always wondered why, and there were a few clients that we had with more violent charges where, you look through it and it's like, dude, come on now. And it was always kind of surprising to me because they would push so hard that they wanted to go to trial so bad.
Yeah.
And I never quite understood that. And the attorneys were very good at being like, look, it's your decision ultimately, but we are pretty certain this is not going to go in your favor. So I don't know.
And look, a lot of the trials that happen, and I'm always really impressed by defense attorneys and how well they can try a case that is an absolute loser, because a lot of them is that. It's not that there's a really good argument. It's just the client, for reasons that aren't clear, is like, I want to go to trial. I remember I had one case where we literally had the guy, we had an informant, and he was wearing a video camera. So, he walks into where this guy is selling drugs, and there's literally a picture of him holding a bag of methamphetamine that we had because our informant then purchased this like kilogram. It's basically like a freezer bag full of methamphetamine. And it's like, you can see the guy clear as day holding the bag up. He buys the drugs from him, goes back, gives them back. We indict the guy. Defense attorney begged this guy to plead guilty. Didn't want to plead guilty. Didn't want to plead guilty. So, we're going to go to trial. We pick a jury. I've got my whole, what I'm going to say, an opening ready. We pick a jury. We're literally, the next thing that's going to happen is a judge is going to instruct the jury, and then we're going to do openings. And the defense attorney comes into the courtroom like he just won the lottery and is like, Your Honor, he wants to plead. So he ends up pleading guilty, which was definitely the best thing for him. But, it was just a situation where, what is the defense? You're literally on camera holding the bag of methamphetamine that I'm going to hold up and say, here's the bag, here's the video. It's the same bag,
Yeah.
And you just never know. Because like you said, it is their right. And if they want to do it, they can.
That always kind of made me think of, it makes me think of the Delphi case and taking all of the chaos out of it, just like the case itself. I always I'm curious to know if he had like asked his attorneys if he could plead, because I just wonder, based on all of the confessions that he gave, like, I don't know, because if your client comes and tells you that they want to plead guilty, like, isn't that kind of like what you have to go with?
This is a better question for a defense attorney, because it's one of
Right.
those that I don't really understand exactly what was going on in that case. Because on the one hand, I think it seems to me that if your client wants to plead guilty, you need to facilitate that. But it's also your job to give them advice, right?
Mhm.
So in the same way, if your client says, I want to go to trial, well, you can say, I think, to the client, well, that's your right, but here's the 10 reasons you shouldn't do that. And I think what happened in the Richard Allen case was there was, I think, a time, and I think it's pretty evident from his statements, like you were saying, and the things he said to his wife, the things he said to his mother, that he wanted to plead guilty. He wanted to do that. He wanted to admit what he did. He wanted to accept responsibility. He wanted to clear his conscience. And I think from the defense attorney perspective, in that case, there wasn't a whole lot of legal incentive to plead. And you saw this a lot in the discussions about the case. People would say, why would he plead guilty? He can't get anything out of it. He's going to get life in prison, right? Death penalty's not on the table. And it's like, yeah, that's one aspect of it. And I understand from your defense attorney perspective. But another aspect is this is a human being who has to live with this for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe saying that he did it and getting that off his conscience and starting to, make something of the rest of his life in prison, which, you can do a lot of good from prison. Maybe that is more important. But I don't think his attorney saw it that way. And I think his family was so dead set on that he didn't do it. They couldn't accept it. And we see this a lot. You talk about going to trial. The number of times people go to trial because their mother or their girlfriend or their wife is telling them they don't need to plead guilty. They need to fight this. It happens all the time. And I think that's what you saw in that case. And I think by the time he was asked in open court by the judge if he had any interest in pleading guilty, because she did ask him that, I think by that point he had changed his mind and he was back on, we might as well roll the dice.
It's just so unfortunate to me, because you wonder if around the time he's making all these confessions, if he was just like ready to be done with it. And then, too, you think, I have to think he wouldn't want to put his own family through that. Who knows if he cares at all about the victims' families, but it's like, to put his own family through all of that too. Getting into like intervention, prevention, rehabilitation. Can you explain how are prosecutors involved in, like, when you're kind of working with a case and say they plead guilty and they get a certain amount of time, but then they also have these like court mandated programs that they have to do that are, I think, ideally supposed to be to kind of help them and rehabilitate them and whatever. How involved are you guys in that process of deciding those factors?
So that is not, well, in our office, not very.
Mm-hmm.
Once it gets to that point, it's interesting the sort of arc of power that prosecutors have. At the very beginning, prosecutors have a lot of power when they're deciding whether to charge a case, deciding whether or not to indict a case. They also have power at the beginning with certain diversionary things you can do. So let's say you have somebody who has drug issues. In a lot of jurisdictions, there's drug court that you can sort of divert cases into and say, look, this is somebody, what they did, they robbed a store, right? But we know it was because they have this crippling drug habit. Let's try and get them help and see if maybe they can be rehabilitated and move on without having to go to prison or without having this on the record. We can do that. Pretrial diversion is sort of another thing. Somebody commits a crime, but it's their first crime. It wasn't a violent crime. Safety valve. So, if tomorrow you decide, you know what, I really want to traffic in cocaine, right? And you're just like, I'm going to buy a kilo of cocaine and I'm going to sell it. Well, if you have no criminal record and it's just you and you don't use a gun, you can do something called safety valve, where basically we say, okay, crazy person, I'm not sure why you did that, but we're kind of going to give you one. We give you one free cocaine trafficking and say, don't do that again. So you do have these options sort of at the beginning. If you get past that, you get to guilty plea, you get to trial, somebody gets sentenced to a significant sentence. How rehabilitation works typically is controlled more by your probation offices, your correctional, the people who implement it. Now, having said that, at some point, the pendulum starts swinging back to prosecutors. Maybe you have parole in your system. Prosecutors can have a lot of say in that. If a prosecutor comes in and says, look, I prosecuted this guy, got him sentenced to 30 years, and he absolutely deserved that. But let me tell you, in the last 10 years, he's done all these amazing things in prison. He's shown that he's turned his life around, and I think he deserves parole. That is incredibly powerful with a parole board, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have that, things like compassionate release, where it's similar thing, where you're always going to be asked, what do you think about this? And if you say, pardons, another one. If you say, yeah, I think they should do it, it becomes important. The nuts and bolts of rehabilitation, though, that is typically, there's a whole group of people who handle that and have a lot more expertise than your average prosecutor. So it's good that they do.
When I was with the public defender's office, we would get a lot of the same people kind of coming through, probation violations, stuff like that, or just, getting a different charge and whatever. How well do you think our current system of rehabilitation works, like within like the criminal justice system as a whole? Like, do you think we're doing a good job?
Well, I think that's another difficult question because I think it varies so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
I think some states put more resources into it than others. But I think one thing you would probably find is, and I haven't done the study, so I could be completely wrong about this. This is just my experience. I think probably if you looked at return on resources, there's probably a point where it doesn't actually do any much better. So like there's probably a point where you need to reach to have an effective rehabilitation program. But after that point, if you pour money into it, it's not going to make much difference. And the reason is because rehabilitation, much like, addiction recovery, is so dependent on the person. And I've had several cases where people were in prison for a very long time, and a defense attorney would come to me and say, I do all this for my office. I do all the compassionate release. I do all that stuff. So I see all of them. And there are certain cases where a defense attorney will come to me and say, look, really take a look at this one, because this guy, he's in prison for forever, but just look at what he's done. And I had one that I always think about because it was the one that opened my eyes the most to this. He had a 40-year prison sentence. He'd served 20. He had, he was like the head of the prison at this point, basically. I mean, he was every guard wrote him a letter. The warden wrote him a letter. He had done every class you could do. he led the prison ministry. It was just like this incredible story, really. So I decided, okay, fine, we're going to do it. We're going to let him out. So we let him out. He opened a business. He talks to kids. He goes around talking to schools and everything. And so typically what happens is when you're let out of prison, you're on some sort of probation for a while, where we watch you. You have to check in with your probation officer. And if you do anything, you can go back to prison. And usually this is for like 5-10 years. It can be a long time. But if you do well, you can petition to have it revoked and you're just free. And so this guy, after a year, he made his petition and he comes in and the judge is like, look, I mean, I've never seen anything like this. I'm going to let you go. But he said, I want to know, how did you do this? And what can we take from your experience to help make this better, make this whole program better? Because this judge in particular is very thoughtful and thinks about that a lot. And the guy said, when I got into prison, I was looking at 40 years in prison, no parole, no chance of parole. So when I got in, I had to decide, what am I going to do? And he said, my body was in prison, but I never let my mind be in prison. I always was planning for the future. I was planning for what I was going to do when I got out. I never lost hope. And I didn't let myself become part of the prison culture. And he said, some guys, they come in and it's like they just transferred their criminal activity from outside the prison to inside the prison. And they like the prison and they become sort of part of the prison culture and part of, the things that go on in prison, which are frankly criminal, right? And he said, and those guys, their mind's in prison too. And if they get out of prison, they're just going to go right back because that's just what they're doing. And he was like, but how you get people to do that? And he was like, look, I don't know why. I was just lucky. I mean, that was just the way I decided to approach it. But how you get people to think that way, I don't know. If someone's thinking that way, then those programs, the education, all that stuff, it's going to work great. And they're going to take that and they're going to be able to rebuild their lives. I did another one about a year ago. And that guy, by the time he got out of prison, he could do anything. He could do HVAC. He could do he was an electrician. He could do plumbing. He could do anything. And before he even got out of prison, already had all these job offers lined up, making a lot of money. And he's done great because he was the same type of approach. But it takes someone deciding to do that. And that is the hard thing.
I agree. And I'm always looking at all these different programs, like, drug rehab programs. Like, my mom has always been in drugs. She's always been in and out of the system. And I always wonder, out of all the rehabs that she goes to, it's like, why doesn't it stick? But I think that's it. It's like, you can have all of these programs and they could be the best thing ever. But it's like, if the person doesn't want to change and they're not willing to do it, then it's like, it's never going to work for them. It's a tough one.
I think people look at it all the wrong way. Mm-hmm. They'll look at those programs and they'll say, man, this program is a failure. We should cut this program. It only has a 10% success rate. That is not the way to look at it. Mm-hmm. The way to look at it is, did the people who went in there with the right attitude benefit? Like, are those 10% all the guys or gals who went in wanting to succeed and the program got them to success? That program is amazing. And you need to have that resource for those people. But the program itself, there is no program, no matter how well created it is, that will help people who don't want to be helped.
So when looking at sexual assault cases, I know over the years, I think we've made some strides in like removing the barriers that victims face when coming forward. There's, a lot of reasons why people don't report it, but conviction rates for sexual assault cases are still very low. Why do you think that is?
Well, that is a complex question. I think there's a few things. I mean, number one, you'll occasionally hear stats like the number of false reports of sexual assault are basically on par with the number of false reports of like a robbery or a car break-in, right? Like this notion that there's a lot of false reports just isn't true. But I think in people's minds, just as a society, we believe that there are false reports. And we all know of like an anecdotal example where there was one, right? And those do so much damage. I'm thinking of the Virginia University of Virginia rape case. It became like it was in the Rolling Stone article, and the whole thing, it blew up, and Rolling Stone had to pay like millions of dollars to somebody who'd been accused, and or the Duke lacrosse case. I mean, they're just examples, right? And those examples are the exception. But in the public's mind, and public becomes jurors, right? In the public's mind, that is a real thing. And they know it's a real thing because they've seen it happen. So I think they have in their mind a higher evidentiary threshold than they would if it were just a robbery. If somebody came in and said, that guy robbed me, they'd have one threshold. If they come in and say, that guy raped me, they have another threshold. Also, most sexual assaults are not stranger based, right? So we just have we're just much more likely to convict somebody who's accused of being a stranger who commits a crime against somebody than we are against someone in some sort of domestic situation. Just we still are that way. But the fact of the matter is, most crimes are committed by people including sexual assaults. So you have that. Then you have the difficulty of just, when it is that, you have the difficulty of proving intent and knowledge and everything else, right? That you always have to prove. We're having to show, I'm really approaching this from a prosecutor's perspective right now. I'm thinking through these cases. You have to show somehow that this wasn't consensual, right? And, you have difficult situations where people have been dating, they've had sex before, and something happens where there's a sexual assault, right? And you listen to the victim and you believe it, but you now have to convince a jury of that. And there's just a lot of jurors who are like, really? They've been, they just don't want to accept it. So I think it's a societal problem, and that will only go away through sort of more education and more talking about it. And I think there are a lot of women out there and men, but obviously women tend to suffer the brunt of this, who the bravery of standing up and speaking about these things, which we've seen a lot of recently in cases with powerful people, I think is really important, because I think it opens people's eyes to this. The other problem, which you put your finger on, is if someone breaks into your car or robs you or mugs you or shoots you or stabs you, most likely you're going to report that to the police immediately, right? Most people don't feel ashamed of having a crime committed against them, but for deep-seated reasons, people often do feel ashamed when they are sexually assaulted. And so, or they don't think anyone will believe them for all the reasons we're just talked about, or they don't want to relive it. They don't want to have to testify about it. They don't want to have to talk about it. It's one thing to say someone shot me. It's another thing to say someone raped me, right? So there's all these barriers to people coming forward. Or they're afraid of the person because they live with the person, or they see him every day, or they're their boss, or they're in a position of power, or all the various reasons, or they're related to them, all the reasons they don't want to come forward. And so a lot of times it takes a long time for people to either build up to it, or to realize someone cares, or to get past whatever the barrier was. But the problem is, once they do come forward, evidence outside of their own words tends to be difficult to find, or the statute of limitations has passed. The Cosby case, which I think most people are familiar with, most of those assaults happened 20, 25, 30 years ago. So even if you have really good evidence, if the statute of limitations has passed, you legally cannot bring the charge. So you have all these different things coming together. So the perfect storm, really, of preventing those cases from being proven. And, I think we are doing the right things. I'll say that. There are organizations that support people who are victims. The laws are getting broader. Those statutes of limitations are getting longer. Technology is improving. We're able to find evidence oftentimes in ways we couldn't before. But the biggest thing is, I think, the way society views the crime and the way it views victims of the crime. And, I think everything becomes politicized, right? So everything becomes political, so you can't even talk about things. But, you know, we had this sort of believe all women thing, right? And that very quickly became divisive because people were like, what do you mean? I mean, what if they're lying, right? I mean, what about innocent until proven guilty? I don't think that's what people meant by that. I don't think they meant, well, she said it, put him in prison. We don't even have to have a trial, right? That's not what they meant. What they meant was give people the same benefit of the doubt for this crime that you give for any crime that's committed, right? And let the chips fall where they may when it comes to a trial. We need to get to that point where we view these crimes as, and we view them as serious. We view them as serious as other crimes. We do that. But what we don't do is give victims the same victim status as we do people who are victims of other crimes.
As a prosecutor, are there any crimes you think should be decriminalized?
Crimes that I think should be decriminalized. You know, I used to be a big fan of marijuana decriminalization, but I actually feel like, having seen the effects of that in some places, I'm not entirely sure it's a good idea. So I don't know. I don't like, you know, quote unquote victimless crimes are tough, right?
Yeah.
So drugs are difficult if you are a user of drugs, because there is a certain extent to which people want to say, well, you know, why would we punish people for making the decision to do something that maybe is harmful to them? And I get that. But I think there is a certain, and I think this is a difficult philosophical question. There is a certain extent to which society should say, we really don't think you should do drugs because it's really bad for you. And if you do it, we're going to take action. And frankly, taking action may be the only way to save your life, right? Like, I don't actually think having people pass that on the sidewalk, you know, with a heroin needle in their arm is a good thing. Like, that is not, look at how, you know, forward thinking we are. I want that person to get some sort of help. And one of the problems you have, of course, is you do things like you decriminalize stuff and you give no funding to the other side of things, right? It's like, well, we decriminalized it. Problem solved. Like, watch the crime rates fall now that that's not a crime. But we're not actually doing anything to address the problem, right? And the sad fact of the matter is, prison in the United States is combination mental health center, drug rehab center, you know, educational facility for a lot of people. If they're going to get mental health treatment, it's going to be because they went to prison. If they're going to get drug rehab, it's going to be because they went to prison. If they're going to get educational opportunities past high school, it's going to be because they went to prison. And so I feel like you can't work on the one side of it without working on the other side of it. And I feel like too often we focus on things like, we need to get, you know, we need to have fewer people in prison because it's bad to have too many people in prison, or we need to decriminalize things because, you know, we really don't want these people being charged with crimes for what they do, but we never work on the flip side of it. So I don't know. I mean, I think the law is incredibly complicated, which isn't a good thing. I think there's a lot of ways in which it's difficult. I mean, they're all those sayings that, like, you break the law every day. Like, everyone breaks the law in some way they don't even realize, you know, because there's so many laws and regulations. So that's probably a bad thing. But it's hard for me to point to a specific law that I'm like, we definitely don't, we should get rid of that one, right? At least any that are enforced. I'm sure there's like some ridiculous laws on the book still, but real laws, typically they're there for some reason.
Yeah, no, I always think of decriminalizing drugs as well. And I think, like, I don't know, I think marijuana is like the easy one, because I think you've seen like some states where it seems like they have like a decent system. But again, like you said, sometimes the only reason that people are able to even get into a drug rehab is because they're going through the criminal justice system. So it's like you can't just wipe certain things off the books if you're not going to like prop up the support systems, you know. You did an interview, and I couldn't find it, but it was on Legal Briefs, and it was with a girl, and she was talking about the death of an inmate in Jasper, Alabama, Anthony Mitchell. And that's kind of blown up to be a whole thing recently, but just looking at kind of how he ended up getting to jail. He was clearly having some sort of psychotic episode. And so his cousin had called 911 and was like, hey, he needs an ambulance, whatever. Cops show up. Of course, you know, everything escalates, gets out of control. He shoots towards him, whatever. But what do you think about some proposals for having like alternative responses to people with mental health issues?
Well, I think those are really hard because people with mental health issues can be really dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, as you said, I mean, he does shoot at the cops, right?
Yeah.
That's typically a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worry for the safety, frankly, of the people who are doing it. I think, and we're doing more of this, police officers now are asked to be community resource people, teachers, babysitters, mental health professionals, counselors, marriage counselors. I mean, they're asked to do so many things, and they're trained in so many of these things because we recognize more and more that a lot of really bad things start small. So the most dangerous call a police officer can make, for instance, is a domestic violence incident. Police officer shows up, a domestic violence incident. You know, if you hear about a cop being shot, so often it's they show up at a domestic violence incident and someone shoots them, right? Similarly with these mental health issues, they can spiral out of control so quickly. So I think one thing we definitely need to continue to do is to train officers on how to respond to that. You know, I'm thinking of this case, and I forget where it's out of, but you'll be familiar with it. The one with the lady with the boiling water on her.
Yes. Yep. I know what
She's
you're
got
talking
the
about.
boiling water on her stove. She's clearly having some sort of mental break. She throws the water. I mean, it doesn't come anywhere near the officer, but he shoots her and kills her, right? I think he's been charged with murder in that case. He probably will be convicted in that case. But, and he's actually not a great example because I think he had a terrible record before that too. But let's assume he didn't have that. Let's assume that he's just like he's like a rookie, right? And you see that sometimes. You know, that officer, he may do something, but I think look at why it happened. Don't necessarily just demonize him immediately because, you know, maybe if he'd had the right training, he could have de-escalated that and not had it happen. So I don't know about replacing officers with these folks. Number one. Number two, I don't think there's the funding for it because, and this is another thing, we just, as a country, and I don't care what your politics are, we just don't like to fund anything. We don't like to spend money on anything. We spend a ton of money. I don't know how we spend as much money as we do because we don't want to spend money on anything, right? But things we do not spend money on. We do not spend money on mental health. We just don't. And we don't anywhere. I mean, the best mental health system in the country barely spends any money on. It's probably Massachusetts or something like that. You know, and where I'm from, we just don't spend any money on it. And it is an escalating problem. And more, you know, we got rid of mental health facilities, insane asylums, whatever you want to call them, because, well, that's cruel. This is kind of like going back to our decriminalization thing. Well, that's cruel. It's cruel to put people in that we should get rid of those, right? We're getting rid of those. Look at what we accomplished. We got rid of mental health facilities. Now, what are we going to do with these people? Well, that's their problem, right? So, like, what happens? They end up on the street. They end up in prison. They end up homeless. And we just don't deal with it. And it just is an escalating issue. And I don't know how to deal with it. And I think it wouldn't be a bad thing to have more people with that training with officers. You know, maybe you have them as partners with officers. But once again, you're going to have to pay for them somehow. And most police departments right now are dramatically low on numbers. So they are way under their capacity for what they're supposed to have. You know, what sort of in order to police a city this size, we need 500 officers and they have 300, right? And that's a huge problem that people don't recognize. But if you wonder, like, why are we having these weird crime spikes in places? Well, one of the reasons is we just don't have any police officers. So I don't know if the funding's there to do it, even though I think it's really important that we do.
Yeah. You got to find a better word than like insane asylum, but it's like, I know what you mean. And obviously when other people hear like insane asylum, they think of like season 2 of American Horror Story. And it's like, no, that's not it's not what we're talking about here. But I think that's a good point. I mean, I think in my opinion, it seems like we put too much on the criminal justice system, and I wish there was a way that we could fund something like on the medical side, like just for mental health issues, right? Like, how can we expand access to mental health care for people, and get more hospitals that are specifically designed for that kind of thing? And I think that's something that, yeah, regardless of people's politics, they would agree on it. You recently spoke with Julia Cowley on The Consult, and you guys were talking about ethics and true crime. And it was a really great discussion that you guys had. And I think you guys also posted today, you helped co-write like a Substack article talking about the Delphi trial and how technology like not only helped the case, but then on the other hand has also hurt it. When we're looking at these cases, and I know people have always had obsessions with these big cases, like you think of, Scott Peterson, John Benet Ramsey, but it seems like the obsession then was different than I feel like the obsession that we're seeing now with some of these cases like Richard Allen and Karen Reed. When did you start to see this kind of shift in people's like fascination, like unhealthy, with these cases?
So I think it's always been unhealthy. I think it has changed, but I think it's changed maybe more subtly. If you think about it, think of John Benet Ramsey, right? Obviously a case a lot of people were obsessed over, and there was a lot of really unethical coverage of that case. But it was nevertheless limited to, the National Enquirer, right? I mean, that's where you would read about the tabloids, That's what we called them. We called them tabloids, and people knew you can read that for entertainment, but don't expect to be getting the full truth out of it, right? And everybody kind of knew that. And I think a lot of people's obsession, it was narrower, and I think this is important, they did not necessarily have the microphone to spread that obsession that they do now. And, initially it was like chat rooms or whatever, message boards with a few hundred people, big whoop, you got your crazy theory. What difference does it make? Now, losers like us just buy a microphone, and all of a sudden you're talking and people listening to you, right? And thinking, wow, that sounds interesting. And you see that more and more. And I think people's ability, the internet is amazing and wonderful in how you can use it to spread knowledge and ideas around the world instantaneously. But the problem is, it's not just knowledge that's going to be spread. It's going to be conspiracy theories. It's going to be, false facts, however you want to call that, fake news, whatever you want to call it. It's going to be people's interpretations that they're going to present as grounded, maybe in fact, when they're not. It's spin. It's so much easier now for people who have a vested interest in a case to spin it where, they have sort of their representatives who are out there saying what they want them to say, and you don't know like where they're getting that information. So I think that is the problem. We have the same thing we've seen in basically every area of life with the internet, with social media, with YouTube, with podcasts, with all of that stuff. Pick your area of life. You probably have a gripe about how the internet has done terrible, horrible things to it, right? I mean, whatever your area of expertise is out there listening. Well, true crime is another one, and there's money to be made. There's a lot of money to be made, and I think that's one reason you see more and more people using technology to spread misinformation, whether intentionally or not, because it's easy to get things wrong and run with it. Delphi was just a good example. I'm really going to see it more. You had the Karen Reed case in Massachusetts. You're going to have the Brian Koberger case in Idaho. Tonight we had the arrest of this individual who probably is responsible for the murder of the United Health CEO. That case is already blowing up, right? And you already see conspiracy theories on Twitter. It's not him. This is all government front. Like he was intentionally set up to cover up the real killer, right? I mean, that's just the way it's going to be. And we love, as a species, we love that stuff, man. We love conspiracies. We love wild ideas. We just love it. We're really into it. The problem is when it's true crime, it has real effects on real people, on our justice system, which is the whole basis of our democracy, on people getting fair trials, on victims getting justice. it can just have this really pernicious effect. And so I just think it's really incumbent on all of us who do this, who do these podcasts, to just try and not contribute to that. And for a while, it was kind of the Wild West. I think people just didn't really think about it. You know, they were having fun and whatever. But I really feel like we've reached a point where this stuff is starting to have a real effect in real life. And I just think we all have a responsibility. So that's why we've been talking about it a lot. Don't have all the answers. Don't want to set myself up as like I'm the moral authority on how to run a podcast. I'm not. I just think everybody should talk about it, think about it, and try and do the best you can.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of sad because I feel like sometimes the people that are consuming this content, and it's the more conspiratorial stuff, it's like I feel like they truly believe that this is happening. And so I almost have like sort of like empathy for them, because I can't imagine, you know, thinking like, oh my God, like there's this huge injustice happening, like I have to do something about it. But then I think of the people that are feeding them that information, and I have a hard time believing that a lot of the creators out there believe what they're telling people, because I think it is more of a money thing. And in my opinion, I don't have anything to back that up, but I think there is an incentive.
You're right.
For clicks and all of that. So yeah. And some of them are smart people, you'd think. And so it's like, you have to have some critical thinking. You can't truly believe that.
So I'm much harder on lawyers than everybody else, just because I've come to realize that unless you do a job, you don't really know anything about it, right? Like, I don't know what it's like to be an ER doctor. I assume it's just like ER. I'm told it's not, right? It's the same type of thing. If you're not in the system, and not even just a lawyer, if you're not in the criminal justice system, you don't really know. Like, you've worked for a public defender's office. I work at a prosecutor's office. We know how it works. We know that most people who are arrested are guilty. We know that most police officers are just doing the best they can, and sometimes they screw up. Some of them, very small percentage of them, are corrupt, and they need to be called out. But very small percentage of them. Not every single case, for instance, is going to have some corruption or conspiracy or evidence planning. It's just not going to happen. You know, we know that judges take their job seriously. We know that most prosecutors are not trying to frame people. We know that most defense attorneys understand their client is guilty, but are doing the very best they can because that is their job under the constitutional system we have, right? And then you see people who should know because they've been in it. They do their podcasts or their Twitter accounts or their blogs, or they go on TV and they're saying things that they don't believe. For instance, there is no one who is a lawyer, whether you've been in the criminal justice system or not, who honestly believes that the judge in the Delphi case was signaling to the prosecution about when to object. That did not happen. And no one who said that, who is a lawyer, believes it happened. But you see people say that. And if you're not a lawyer and you're out there just listening, you're like, oh, wow, what an injustice. What a terrible thing. And it would be. What an absolute dereliction of their job. I mean, that judge should be removed from office and maybe put in prison, right? Like, that's how bad that is. But you have people say this with no consequence.
I hadn't heard that specific theory. That's insane. I mean, to me, like, moon landing conspiracies are fun. Like, that's fun. Okay, like I can,
right.
Like, it doesn't really impact anyone. Like, maybe it makes people at NASA annoyed, but like, or whatever. But like, that's fine.
I'll grant anybody one conspiracy. I think everybody gets one. Like, if everybody can have one conspiracy that they truly believe, I will grant you that. But if you think every big case you've ever heard is a conspiracy, you need to step back because they're not all conspiracies. It's just not the case that all of these different agencies, police officers, judges, and prosecutors across the country in various jurisdictions in very different cases are pulling off these conspiracies, and that the only people who can figure it out are random YouTuber X. That is just not true. That is not happening.
And I always feel like these are probably the same people too, where they hear a story about like someone getting sucked into a cult, and they're probably like, that would never happen to me. And I'm like, really? I don't know about that. I think you're the prime candidate to be pulled into a cult. But okay, I have one last question. It's very deep. Okay. In a 2011 HuffPost interview, you said, as society reevaluates its judgments on good and evil, it's not surprising that the old bad guys are now the ones we're rooting for. So in any
did I say that?
You did say that. So in any sort of genre, book, movie, TV show, who is the most misunderstood villain?
The most misunderstood villain. Huh. Well, I mean, I hate to say Javert from Les Mis, because he's the prosecutor, right? So like, that's awfully stereotypical, but he's just trying to enforce the law. Let's see, the most misunderstood villain. Oh man, there's some good answers for this. I want to get a good one. Who's somebody who's misunderstood? Trying to think of somebody I root for,
Yeah.
I'm like, that guy was obviously in the right. Man, I don't know. You've caught me. There are some great examples out there, but you've caught me off guard, and I can't think of one. I'm going to go with Javert though, because I did think of Javert. I just want to point out a few things about Javert.
Okay.
So in Les Mis, if you haven't seen Les Mis, so Jean Valjean, the number of times that he tells Javert, if you just let me go do this thing, I'll turn myself in, right? He never turns himself in, right? Like, he's like, just let me get, just in the confrontation, just let me get the child. The child's going to die if I don't take care of her. And then I'll turn myself in. Does he turn himself in? No. He says there's one other thing, towards the end, when they're in the sewer, he says he's going to do something. He's going to turn himself in. He didn't turn himself in. He goes into hiding. So I'm just going to point out that Javert was just trying to do what the law required. And Jean Valjean just continuously lied to him. So I love that. I love that musical. So I'm going to go with Javert. Nevertheless, despite the fact it is stereotypical, given that I'm a prosecutor.
I had to look this up too, because I was like, I feel like there is a really good answer to this question. I was like looking it up, and there were some really stupid suggestions online, like Severus Snape, and I'm like, okay, come on now. Like we got his whole story at the end. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, yeah,
exactly.
It's dumb.
It needs to be somebody who, I'll give you, this is not a villain, but this one always bothered me. Like, so have you ever seen The Devil Wears Prada?
Yes.
So the thing about The Devil Wears Prada is the main character, she's in a very difficult situation, but she's living her dream. She's trying to make the best of it, and she's facing all this difficulty in work. And her family and boyfriend are completely unsupportive of her. It's like they just don't cut her any slack. If she misses, she's like 30 minutes late for dinner. She's the worst thing ever. And it's like, you know what? Maybe let her get through this period in her life, like support her during this, and then have all these expectations. So it's stuff like that where it's like, I don't understand why, you're the bad guy.
Yeah.
People like to talk about the Empire in Star Wars, but they're clearly the bad guys. I mean, they blew up a planet, okay, with a bunch of people on it.
Like that's, they're clearly the villains.
Yeah, they're clearly the bad guys, right? So I don't.
Oh my gosh, that's funny that you say The Devil Wears Prada, because that is like the one movie I watch every time I'm on a long flight for some reason, and that always bothers me. Yeah, she walks in and they're like mad at her, and then her phone starts ringing and they're grabbing it, and she's like, "No, it's my boss." And then
so what's wrong with you?
Yeah, I'd be pissed. So, oh my gosh. That's funny.
I think about that a lot, actually, that they just they're just the worst.
Yeah, they're not very good friends. And she also brought him all that free stuff that one time, she's like bringing free bags and whatever. They were so rude.
They were incredibly rude. She deserves better.
Okay.
The other one, like another one that ends poorly, or that has like a bad message. I feel like that movie has a bad message. It's basically like, let your bully family bully you out of your job.
Right.
Grease. The ending of Grease, the message is basically, if you just completely change yourself for a guy, that's what you should do. Just completely change yourself. Whatever will make him happy, be that person. This is basically the message of Grease.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay. Every time I watch that, I love Grease. I love that movie so much. But every time at the end, I'm just like, oh, come on, Sandy. Like, you didn't need to do that. Like,
right. Yeah.
I mean, John Travolta was willing to change a little bit too. So I suppose it was, hopefully it all worked out in the end for him. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
All right. So, Brett, what do you guys have coming up on the podcast on the Prosecutors?
Well, so Alice, she's in the middle of her maternity leave, so we got all our stuff recorded for December, but next year, we're going to start off with a great mystery, a great true crime case that is very strange, very mysterious. We have an innocence case we're going to do, where I think the person may actually be innocent, which is fairly rare for us.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to do a big case. I'm not going to say which one, but we're doing one of the big ones. We're going to spend a lot of time on it. It's going to be another 13, 14, 15, 20 episode
Another
case. So next year is going to be a big year.
Awesome. Well, I will link to your podcast down below. And thank you so much for taking the time to come chat with me today. I think we've solved pretty much most of society's problems. So
I think you're right.
Yeah. I think so.
Congress, we should go testify anytime. We'll tell them what they need to do.
Yeah, let's get it together. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.